very modern microphones that you must speak right into. So when you come to question time, we have a PA system microphone here, so you can get the microphone and speak. Today, Senator Brett Mason, someone who's, I say, well known for being the Senator for Queensland from 1999 to 2015, former ambassador to the Netherlands, and 2015 to August 2018. As a BA and LLB honours, degrees from the Australian National University, as well as the Master of Philosophy in International Relations from Trinity, Cambridge. The former Parliamentary Secretary, various portfolios, is currently Chair of the National Library of Australia. So today we have the cultural centre of the nation here because we have both the Chair of the National Library of Australia and the Chair of the National Archives of Australia. More importantly than all those things though, Brett has in fact produced 3 publications. And one of those he's going to talk about today, Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz. Something which I'm sure you'll find all very interesting. Now, before we go on to that, just a couple of other matters. The toilets are upstairs on the second level. That's come off William Street, that level, if you're looking for those. We're having book sales today. Hannah's down there selling books for the Royal Historical Society, and Arthur's selling Brett's book, Wizards of Oz. I'd also like to give a special welcome to the acting president of the Royal Historical Society, Dan Morgan, and we have several other members of the council here today. And of course, we also have the chair of the House here, Claire Moore. So welcome to you, Claire. We're all looking forward to the changes, the opening of the House. On Friday night, we have the launch of the Griffith and Petrie exhibition upstairs on the middle level, level 1. So if you're a member of the society and haven't indicated you're coming, this is open to all members of the society free of charge. One of the benefits you get, the wonderful exhibition launched on Friday night between 5:30 and 7. We're having a wine and cheese, thanks to Glenn the Sheep, the wonderful cheese. It'll be a wonderful night as we've had in the past, something not to be missed. Ladies and gentlemen, we give a very special welcome to our special guest today, the Honourable Dr. Brett Mason.
Denver, thank you. Denver, thank you so much for that very warm introduction to our acting president, Dan Morgan, and to previous presidents I knew in a former life, Denver and Stephen. Claire Moore, my old sparring partner, great to see you, Claire. My great friend Arthur Shrenkoff down the back, without whom there would be no Book of Wizards of Oz, and certainly not much fun. Ladies and gentlemen, may I first thank all of you, the Society, for so kindly inviting me to address it. It's an honour for someone not trained in history, but instead in the dark arts of law and politics. So forgive me if I stray from the facts, or at least arguable facts, into the contentious and to the speculative. But I'll do my best not to succumb to the temptations and bad habits of a professional lifetime. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to say a word with you about 2 Australians who, with little doubt, are among the most consequential Australians ever born. The Wizards of Oz, Howard Florey and his childhood friend, Mark Oliphant. You are unusual. This group here this afternoon is unusual because the truth is most Australians know very little or perhaps nothing at all about Howard Florey, the maker of penicillin, and fewer still know much about Mark Oliphant. If anything, perhaps there's some vague uneasiness about the atom bomb and in South Australia perhaps that Mark Oliphant was once governor of that fine state. But sadly, few Australians recognise their names, the Wizards of Oz. As you are then a particularly learned and obviously a very good-looking audience, can I start with a question, if that's okay? Has anyone seen the Academy Award-winning film Oppenheimer, starring Cillian Murphy? Oh, many of you. Okay, thank you. Oh, okay. And directed by Christopher Nolan, you'll recall. Won the Academy Award, I think, for Best Picture, didn't it? Cillian Murphy, Best Actor or something. Christopher Nolan, the director of the film, was quoted as saying that, and I quote, "Robert Oppenheimer is the most important person who ever lived. He made the world we live in, for better or for worse." Now, clearly, Christopher Nolan has not read my book. Just exactly what Oliphant and Florey did, what they achieved, and the circumstances in which they made their discoveries, with the bloodiest conflict in human history happening all around them, the Second World War, is much less understood and appreciated than what Oppenheimer did. Never mind the full implications of both Oliphant and Florey's achievements. Howard Florey and Mark Oliphant were born within a few years and a few kilometres of each other in Adelaide at the turn of the 20th century. Florey and Oliphant knew each other as children, as undergraduates at the University of Adelaide, as graduate students at Cambridge in the late 1920s, and of course, during the Second World War. And then in Canberra, where they worked together to establish the ANU and to promote science. Mark Oliphant, indeed, helped to found the Academy of Science and served as its first president in 1954, 70 years ago this year. The most exciting discovery, or indeed realisation to me, as I researched their extraordinarily full and active lives, was the parallel nature of Florey and Oliphant's wartime work. And wartime was, without a doubt, the most important time of their lives. This, very briefly, ladies and gentlemen, is what they did. In February and March of 1940, that's early in the Second World War, teams led by Mark Oliphant at the University of Birmingham first came up with a workable design for a so-called cavity magnetron, a device that made microwave radar possible. Radar small enough that it could be carried on an aircraft or a ship or a truck. Up until then, radar was long wave, characterised by 70-metre wooden towers on the eastern coast of Great Britain. And some of those towers are still there today as tourist attractions. You can see them. That's 70 metres tall. And at the time of the Battle of Britain, that is what the British had. That was their radar, and that is what they relied on to deter the Luftwaffe. The cavity magnetron, on the other hand, could fit in the palm of your hand. The smaller the radio wave, the greater the penetration through clouds and through rain, and with far, far better definition, or clarity, if you like. With microwave radar, you could see further, more clearly, during day and night and in all weather. So the cavity magnetron was revolutionary and changed the course of the Second World War. It is commonly described as the most militarily significant innovation of the Second World War. Then, secondly, just a fortnight later, yes, a couple of weeks later, in March 1940, Oliphant's Birmingham laboratory then came up with the first proof, the first calculations that an airborne atomic bomb was not just theoretically possible, but it was technically feasible to build, and to build now in 1940. There had been speculation, some of it by even Albert Einstein and others, that a bomb might be built sometime in the future, and it would take, billions of dollars to build, and you'd need tons and tons of fissile uranium. But no one thought it could be built now, certainly not in the short term. Then, just a couple of months later, in May of 1940, Howard Florey's team at Oxford conducted trials on albino mice with a substance they successfully extracted from mould called penicillin, and demonstrated that penicillin kills bacteria, that it kills entrenched infection within a body without harming the body itself. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's very easy to say that or to write that, but that changed human history. It changed the course and the fortunes of humankind from that day on. Here at last, we have something that will kill an infection within the body without harming the body itself. And this is the first time in human history that this is possible. This is happening in May 1940. So, over this dramatic period of 100 days in early 1940, incidentally, Florey's mice tests coinciding precisely with the perils of the Dunkirk evacuation, less than 250 kilometres across the Channel from his Oxford laboratory. Just as that was starting, Florey was doing the albino mice tests. Oliphant and Florey's respective teams, in this dramatic period of 100 days, their teams made breakthroughs that made possible microwave radar, commonly regarded as the scientific breakthrough critical to winning the war, the atom bomb, the weapon that ended the war, and penicillin, the miracle treatment that enabled countless casualties to survive the war and after. Now, that's not bad, is it? But that's not all. That is not all. If that was the extent of Oliphant and Florey's contribution to the world, that, ladies and gentlemen, would be great enough. But there's much more. But the story is not straightforward. Science is important, but science isn't enough, especially in war, unless you can apply it, unless you can make it work, unless you can persuade people of the importance of what you have done. I don't like this word, but let me use it. That you can operationalise your inventions and innovations. That's what becomes important. Acceptance of microwave radar was, as my young nephews would say, that was a no-brainer. It was relatively straightforward. Both the British and the Americans, and indeed many other nations, were looking to develop microwave radar because they understood its importance. With microwave radar, pilots and sailors could see the enemy or a target much more clearly from a greater distance in any weather, day or night. And it was the principal reason, frankly, why the Allies were ultimately victorious against German U-boats in the Battle of the Atlantic, where Allied bombers and ships could finally detect and then destroy the U-boat wolf packs. It was the principal reason why the Allies won the Battle of the Atlantic. And indeed, that was the last big battle, of course, being won by Nazi Germany. When shown Oliphant's cavity magnetron for the first time in late 1940, the Americans at first could not believe its power. When they did, they threw all they had into refining and perfecting it. The America's official history written just after the war, describing the cavity magnetron as the most valuable hardware ever brought to America's shores. That's something, isn't it? But penicillin and the atom bomb were quite different. Oliphant and Florey largely managed to persuade British authorities of the importance of these discoveries. But the problem was that Britain, besieged by Hitler's Luftwaffe and by the U-boats, simply didn't have the spare industrial capacity to mass produce penicillin, nor indeed to make an atomic bomb. Only the United States, remember, they're still neutral, they were still neutral, could. But the question is, would they? And so, in mid to late 1941, 15 months after the initial discoveries, we have another period of 100 days when both Florey and Oliphant, unbeknownst to each other, they didn't know that each other was going, they flew on secret missions to the United States to try to convince the Americans to make penicillin and build the bomb. Florey was there between July and September of 1941, and Oliphant between August and October of the same year, knocking on doors, arguing, lobbying, and hassling the reluctant and courtly Americans to take on these two big projects, to mass manufacture the first broadly effective antibiotic, penicillin, and to build an atom bomb before Adolf Hitler did. I describe the tension of these times, and not just tension, the desperation of both Florey and Oliphant in chapter 9 of the book, which I titled Aussie Stirrers. I thought that's just what the Aussies were there. That's what they were doing, stirring up the scientific establishment in the United States. It was tough, actually much tougher than you might think. From the perspective of fighting Hitler, both penicillin and an atom bomb might sound obvious to us today, but just remember, ladies and gentlemen, how little Oliphant and Florey possessed to persuade the sceptical and still neutral Americans. What little they had to persuade them. There was Oliphant. There was Mark Oliphant, turning up, relying essentially on the 3 pages of the original memorandum, the original theoretical proof, drafted by 2 German Jewish refugee scientists working with Oliphant, Otto Frisch and Rudolf Piles, that had now been peer-reviewed by a committee of top British scientists. Yes, those scientists said the bomb could be built now. But in mid-1940, hardly any American scientists agreed with Oliphant and the British, including, I should quickly add, ladies and gentlemen, Robert Oppenheimer, who was introduced to the atom bomb project by Mark Oliphant, and not the Nobel laureate Ernest Lawrence, as implied in the film. And in fact, the American committee tasked by President Roosevelt with investigating building the bomb had not even considered the research conducted in Britain. If that was tough, you might think, well, that's pretty tough for poor old Mark Oliphant. If that was tough, just try, I saw Bob Tucker come in before, and I know Bob knows about chemists and chemistry, right? So let's try Howard Florey's brief to persuade the Americans to manufacture penicillin, right? So he goes across and he's talking to Pfizer and Merck and the great US pharmaceutical companies, right? And can you imagine it? He sits down and the executives of Pfizer and Merck say, before we mass manufacture this drug, Dr. Florey, tell us, what is your case history? What is your case history with penicillin? What are the results of the human trials, sir? Oh. Here, says Howard Florey, holding up a test tube with a dusty brown powder at the bottom. We have tried penicillin on human beings. How many, Dr. Florey? Under his palm, he says 6. And they go, what, is that 6,000? He says, no, 6. Half a dozen. Now, that half a dozen, 2 of them died. But then he looks at the executives and says, but don't worry, we have much better results from the albino mice. So it wasn't easy. It was extraordinarily difficult. You know, that was his case history. It wasn't strong. You imagine trying that today, it simply, you'd be laughed out of court. Both Florey and Oliphant left the United States and returned to Britain, not knowing if they had succeeded. In the end, it was a close call. You can read about it in the book. But they did succeed. They both found powerful advocates who in the end persuaded the top decision makers to take on these big scientific and technological challenges. In short, it's extraordinary. We have 2 days, 2 consecutive days, no less, in October 1941, and 2 meetings involving Vannevar Bush, who was President Roosevelt's science czar, the head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, and tasked with weaponising scientific research for use in war. On the 8th of October 1941, having been lobbied by Florey and others, Bush meets with the American pharmaceutical industry and tells them, mass manufacture penicillin, it's of the highest priority for war. Florey succeeded then, but didn't know about it for weeks. And the very next day, the 9th of October 1941, Vannevar Bush, having been lobbied by Oliphant and others, meets President Roosevelt in the White House and tells him that American scientists have finally been convinced by their British counterparts that an atom bomb is not a distant pipe dream, but that can actually be built in the next few years. Roosevelt then gives the go-ahead to the US atomic program and initiates hurried US testing of British calculations. The US was quickly convinced by British science, and on the 6th of December 1941, the day before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt gives the go-ahead for the building of the atomic bomb. After the war, Vannevar Bush wrote that World War II was the first war in human history to be effected decisively by weapons unknown at the outbreak of hostilities. And he named the principal breakthrough weapons as microwave radar and the atomic bomb. Indeed, it's the commonly expressed view that while the atom bomb ended the war, it was microwave radar that won it for the Allies. And then he mentioned penicillin. It was not a weapon, of course, but it saved countless millions of lives during and after the war and revolutionised human healing. So, we have Oliphant and Florey, 2 childhood friends from Adelaide, who led teams that over a period of 100 days in early 1940 developed a device that was critical to winning the war, microwave radar, conceived a powerful weapon that ended it, the atomic bomb, and produced a miracle treatment that enabled countless casualties to survive it, penicillin. And then in another 100 days of tireless advocacy in late 1941, they ensured that the full potential of these breakthrough innovations would be realised during the course of the war. They were instrumental in persuading the United States to make all 3. For certain, we can say this about our fellow Australians. We can say this, that the greatest conflict in human history would have been longer and would have been bloodier without them. It would have finished later and maybe not even with the same result. To my mind, this is probably the greatest story that is never told in Australian history. Ladies and gentlemen, David McCulloch, the acclaimed popular American historian, said of his book on the Wright brothers, Empowered Flight, that he wrote the book not so much because he wanted to write it, but because he believed that it should be written, that it needed to be written to document the achievements of the American people. For me too, the story of Mark Oliphant and Howard Florey is a story that had to be told. But this is a story not only of national, of Australian achievement, but one of international and historic significance that has never received proper recognition. One need only think of the recent Oppenheimer film. It says that. It's also a positive story. In these days of sometimes strife and discord, This book shows what Australians can achieve, how significant we are, and how significant we have been. Ladies and gentlemen, Florey and Oliphant had the courage of their hopes and their convictions. Their lives were enlarged by high purpose, and they were never happier than when in their laboratories chasing after those dreams. They pursued their purpose with grit, overcoming obstacles and disappointments. They believed, they battled, they persevered, and the world is a better place for it. We Australians might learn as much from their spirit as from those achievements. Thank you.